September of 1878, the mountains of Watauga County, North Carolina. 7-year-old Cora Dunsworth seemed like any other child living in the remote hollows of Appalachia. She helped her mother with chores, played by the creek that wound through their property, and wore a blue ribbon in her hair that her father had bought her for her 6th birthday. But when she vanished one autumn afternoon while fetching water, those who would later piece together the truth understood something far more sinister than a simple disappearance had occurred. What railroad surveyors discovered 4 years later, 12 miles deep in the uncharted mountain wilderness, would expose a darkness that even the hardened residents of these isolated peaks could scarcely comprehend. Today, we're uncovering the story of Cora Dunsworth. This is her dark history. The Appalachian Mountains in the 1870s were a world unto themselves. While industrialization transformed the eastern cities and railroads stitched the nation together, the mountain families of western North Carolina lived much as their ancestors had for generations. Small tenant farms clung to hillsides, accessible only by footpaths and wagon trails that turned to impassable mud each spring. Families survived on subsistence agriculture, occasional timber work, and the charity of wealthier landowners who controlled vast tracts of forest land. It was a feudal system in all but name, with poor families like the Dunsworths working land they would never own, beholden to men who wielded power over every aspect of their lives. Emmett and Ada Dunsworth were such a family. They farmed a small plot of rocky soil on land owned by the Vesey family, one of the county's most prominent dynasties. Emmett worked the timber operations during winter months, while Ada tended their 3 children and a small garden that provided most of their food. Cora was their youngest, a quiet child by the accounts that survive. She had 2 older brothers who would spend long days helping their father in the woods. The family lived in a 2-room cabin, drafty and dark, heated by a single stone fireplace. They were poor, but no poorer than their neighbors. By the standards of their time and place, they were unremarkable. The creek that ran near their cabin was Cora's responsibility each morning and evening. It was a 10-minute walk down a familiar path, through stands of oak and hickory, to a bend where the water ran clear and cold. She carried a wooden bucket, sometimes 2 if her mother needed extra for washing. It was a routine she had performed hundreds of times. September 17, 1878 was no different than any other day, except that Cora never came home. Ada Dunsworth noticed her daughter's absence within an hour. The bucket sat unused by the door. When Emmett returned from the woods that evening, he found his wife frantic, already searching the path to the creek. He gathered the boys and several neighbors, and they combed the woods through the night by torchlight. They found nothing. No tracks, no torn fabric, no signs of struggle. The bucket was eventually discovered at the creek's edge, tipped on its side, water long since spilled into the moss. By the following morning, the search had expanded. The Vesey family, as the primary landowners, took charge of organizing search parties. Dozens of men spread through the mountains, calling Cora's name, checking abandoned hunting camps, and cliff overhangs where a lost child might have taken shelter. They searched for 3 days, then a week, then 2. The prevailing theory was that she had fallen into the creek and been swept downstream, though her body was never recovered. Others whispered about the mountain lions that occasionally passed through, or the possibility that she had simply wandered too far and succumbed to exposure. Among those who searched most diligently was Luther Vesey, the younger brother of Edmund Vesey, the family patriarch. Luther was 34 years old, unmarried, and regarded as something of a recluse even by mountain standards. He lived alone in a cabin on the family's most remote holdings, several miles from the nearest neighbor. He rarely came to town, and when he did, people noted his awkward manner and tendency to avoid eye contact. But he was a Vesey, which meant he commanded respect, or at least deference. When Luther volunteered to search the northern sections of the family's land, areas he knew well from years of solitary wandering, no one questioned his motives. Historical records from the Watauga County archives show that the official search was abandoned after 3 weeks. The Dunsworth family held a memorial service in late October, though Ada refused to believe her daughter was dead. Neighbors recall that she would walk to the creek every day for months afterward, calling Cora's name into the woods. Emmett grew increasingly withdrawn, throwing himself into his work with a desperation that worried those who knew him. The 2 older boys, barely teenagers themselves, took on adult responsibilities to keep the farm functioning. The family, in essence, fractured around the absence of one small girl. But Cora was not dead. She was 12 miles away, hidden in a hollow so remote that even experienced hunters rarely ventured there. She was alive, terrified, and utterly alone, except for the periodic visits of the man who had taken her. To understand what happened next, we must understand the geography of these mountains. The land owned by the Vesey family encompassed over 15,000 acres of forest, much of it old growth that had never been logged. Steep ridges gave way to deep hollows where creeks carved through limestone and shale. Some areas were accessible only on foot, requiring hours of difficult hiking through terrain with no marked trails. This was not recreational wilderness. This was backcountry that could swallow a person whole, where even searchers who knew the land could easily miss a hidden hollow just yards from their path. Luther Vesey knew this land better than anyone. He had spent decades walking these ridges, hunting, trapping, and, as would later be discovered, nurturing an obsession that had been growing for years before Cora's disappearance. When investigators finally searched his cabin in 1882, they found a journal dating back to 1874, 4 years before the abduction. The entries were sporadic but telling. They documented Luther's growing fixation on the Dunsworth family, particularly their young daughter. He wrote about watching the cabin from the woods. He noted the times Cora walked to the creek. He described her blue hair ribbon in detail. He speculated about what it would be like if she belonged to him, if he could raise her away from what he called the corrupting influence of settlement life. The journal never explicitly outlined a plan, but the pattern was unmistakable. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was something calculated, nurtured in isolation, and eventually acted upon with chilling deliberation. The hollow where Luther kept Cora was located on what family land records described as unimproved forest, a designation that meant it held no commercial timber value and was unlikely to be visited for any economic purpose. The shelter itself was crude but effective. Luther had built it against a natural rock outcropping, using fallen logs and bark to create a lean-to structure that blended seamlessly with the surroundings. Unless you knew exactly where to look, you could walk within 20 feet and never notice it. Inside, there was barely enough room for a child to lie down. The floor was dirt. The walls, such as they were, consisted of stacked rocks and woven branches. This is where Cora Dunsworth spent 4 years of her childhood, from age 7 to age 11. through 4 winters, 4 springs, 4 cycles of seasons that would have seemed endless to a child who had no understanding of why she had been taken or whether she would ever go home. The details of those 4 years are difficult to reconstruct with precision. Cora herself never provided a coherent account. When she was found, she was functionally nonverbal, communicating through gestures and occasional single words. The trauma had severed her connection to language in ways that never fully healed. But the physical evidence told a story. The dirt walls of the shelter bore hundreds of scratch marks, crude drawings made with a sharp rock or stick. They depicted 2 figures repeatedly, one small, one tall, always wearing a distinctive wide-brimmed hat that matched the style Luther favored. These drawings documented her captor's visits, a child's attempt to make sense of an incomprehensible situation. Luther's journal, combined with evidence found at the site, suggests he visited every 2 to 3 weeks. He would bring supplies: cornmeal, dried beans, occasionally salt pork or preserved vegetables. He brought her a blanket when winter came. He brought rope, though there is no evidence he used it for restraint. He did not need to. The psychological prison was sufficient. Cora was miles from anywhere she recognized, surrounded by wilderness she had been taught to fear. She was a child. She had no map, no guide, no way to know which direction might lead to safety. Even if she had tried to run, where would she have gone? According to medical records compiled by Dr. Horace Latimer after her rescue, Cora showed no signs of physical abuse beyond severe malnutrition and exposure-related ailments. This distinction, while important, does not diminish the horror of what was done to her. Psychological captivity can be as absolute as any chain. Luther was not keeping her as a prisoner in the traditional sense. He was attempting something more disturbing. He was trying to reshape her, to make her forget her family, her name, her previous life entirely. His journal entries from this period describe his belief that if he kept her long enough, she would eventually accept him as her only reality. He was, in his own disturbed reasoning, creating a daughter. Meanwhile, life in the valley below continued without her. The Unsworth family survived, though survived is perhaps too generous a word for the existence they endured. Ada's health deteriorated. Neighbors described her as aged beyond her years, hollowed out by grief. Emmett grew harder, more distant. The older boys matured into young men carrying burdens no teenagers should bear. The community, having exhausted its capacity for sympathy, largely moved on. Disappearances, while tragic, were not uncommon in these mountains. Children fell into rivers. They wandered into the wilderness. They succumbed to illness or accident. Life was precarious and death was familiar. No one suspected Luther Vizzi. Why would they? He was strange, certainly, but strangeness was not a crime. He was a Vizzi, which afforded him a presumption of respectability regardless of his personal peculiarities. And he had searched for Cora as diligently as anyone. He had been there in those first frantic days, joining the search parties, calling her name. What no one understood at the time was that he had been steering those searches. When men suggested exploring the northern ridges, Luther quietly redirected them toward areas he knew were barren. When someone proposed checking the remote hollows, he volunteered to search them himself and returned hours later with reports that he had found nothing. This continued for 4 years. The discovery came on October 15, 1882, and it came entirely by accident. Thomas Ridgway and Benjamin Strait were railroad surveyors working for a company exploring potential routes through the mountains. They were not searching for Cora Dunsworth. They did not even know her name. They were simply doing their job, which on that particular day meant pushing through unmapped terrain to take measurements and note landmarks. They had strayed from their planned route, following what Ridgway later described as a more promising grade that might reduce the number of expensive cuts and fills needed for track laying. They almost missed the shelter entirely. Straight noticed it first, or rather, he noticed an unnaturally straight line among the organic chaos of the forest. Upon closer inspection, they realized it was a structure of some kind. Their initial assumption was that they had stumbled upon an old hunting camp, or perhaps a hermit's dwelling. The Appalachian wilderness was known to harbor individuals who preferred complete isolation from society. What they found inside changed everything. The girl was 11 years old. Though she looked younger, her growth stunted by inadequate nutrition. She wore rags that were beyond identification, her original clothing long since worn to tatters and replaced with rough cloth and animal hide. Her hair, once carefully brushed and decorated with a ribbon, hung in matted tangles. She recoiled from them violently, retreating to the farthest corner of the shelter, making sounds that Ridgway described as more animal than human. But it was the cache they found hidden in a nearby rock crevice that confirmed this was no wilderness orphan or abandoned child. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, they discovered items that told a different story. A small blue ribbon, faded but still recognizably the kind sold in general stores. A carved wooden figure, the sort a father might make for a daughter's birthday. And a pair of child's shoes, worn through at the soles, but clearly manufactured, not improvised. These were not the possessions of someone born to the wilderness. They were mementos, keepsakes, proof of a life before this hollow. The surveyors, to their credit, understood the gravity of what they had found. Straight stayed with the girl, while Ridgway hiked out to the nearest settlement, a journey that took him over 4 hours. He arrived at a logging camp as darkness fell and convinced the foreman to provide men and horses. By midnight, a rescue party was assembled. By dawn, they had reached the hollow and carried the girl out of the mountains. The question of her identity was resolved within days. Ada Dunsworth, alerted by the county sheriff that a child had been found in the mountains, made the journey to the doctor's office where the girl was being cared for. The moment she entered the room, despite the years of privation that had transformed her daughter's appearance, Ada knew. She knew by the distinctive birthmark on the girl's shoulder blade, shaped like a thumbprint. She knew by the way Cora's eyes, still capable of recognition even if her voice was not, widened and filled with tears. She knew by the blue ribbon which Ada had tied in her daughter's hair the morning she vanished. Cora Dunsworth had been found, but the girl who returned was not the girl who had disappeared. That child was gone, replaced by someone who had survived something no child should have to survive. The investigation that followed moved with surprising speed, driven by public outrage and the undeniable evidence accumulating with each passing day. Sheriff William McConnell, a man whose previous experience with serious crime was limited to the occasional moonshining operation or property dispute, found himself leading a manhunt that quickly focused on Luther Vizzi. The reasons were circumstantial at first. The location of the hollow was on Vizzi land. Luther knew that terrain better than anyone, and when investigators interviewed search party members from 1878, a pattern emerged. Multiple men recalled Luther discouraging searches in the northern sections of the property, the very area where Cora had been hidden. But circumstantial evidence became concrete when they searched Luther's cabin. The journal was the centerpiece, of course. Its entries, spanning 8 years, provided a chronicle of obsession and eventually abduction. But there was more. Receipts from a general store in the adjacent county showed regular purchases of cornmeal, beans, and other staples in quantities inconsistent with a single man living alone. A distinctive wide-brimmed hat hung by the door, matching the figure in Cora's wall drawings, and in a wooden crate beneath his bed, investigators found the exact type of nail used to construct the shelter in the hollow. Luther was arrested on October 20th, 5 days after Cora's rescue. According to newspaper accounts from the Watauga Democrat, he did not resist. He did not proclaim his innocence. He simply stood silent as the charges were read, his face expressionless. When asked why he had done it, he reportedly said nothing except, "She was supposed to forget." The trial did not take place until May of 1883, delayed by the legal maneuvering of attorneys hired by the Vizzi family. Edmund Vizzi, determined to limit the damage to the family name, employed the best legal minds available in North Carolina. Their strategy was built around a defense of diminished mental capacity. Luther, they argued, was not criminally responsible for his actions due to a lifelong pattern of social maladjustment and what we might today recognize as severe mental illness. They brought in a doctor from Charlotte who testified that Luther exhibited signs of what was then called moral insanity, a condition characterized by an inability to distinguish right from wrong despite intact intellectual functioning. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Samuel Morrison, faced significant challenges. Cora could not testify. Her inability to speak coherently made her useless as a witness, and contemporary legal standards were not equipped to accommodate her condition. The case rested entirely on physical evidence and Luther's own journal, which, while damning, did not describe explicit criminal acts. The journal spoke of watching, of planning, of philosophical musings about child rearing and corruption. It did not say. The closest it came was an entry from October 1878 that read, "The child is where she belongs now, away from their ignorance." The trial lasted 6 days. The courtroom was packed throughout, with spectators traveling from across the county and beyond to witness what the regional newspapers had sensationalized as the Mountain Captivity Case. The Dunsworth family attended every session, Ada sitting in the front row, her face a mask of controlled anguish. Cora was not present. Dr. Latimer had advised against it, believing the trauma of facing her captor would set back what little progress she had made. The verdict came on May 19th. The jury deliberated for 11 hours before finding Luther Vizzi guilty of abduction and unlawful confinement. Notably, he was not convicted of the more serious charges the prosecution had pursued. The diminished capacity defense had worked, at least partially. The judge, Samuel Pritchard, a man known to have business dealings with the Vizzi family, sentenced Luther to 5 years imprisonment. 5 years. For 4 years of captivity. For the psychological destruction of a child. For a crime that newspaper editorials were calling one of the most heinous in the state's history. Public reaction was explosive. The Asheville Citizen published an editorial condemning the sentence as mockery of justice and an insult to decency. Protest gatherings were held in the county seat. The Dunsworth family, however, said nothing publicly. They had neither the social standing nor the resources to challenge the verdict. They were tenant farmers who owed their livelihood to the Vizzy family. Speaking out would have meant economic ruin. Luther served 3 years before being released on parole in 1886. The conditions of his release required him to remain in the custody of his brother Edmund and to avoid contact with children. These conditions were, by all accounts, loosely enforced. Luther returned to his isolated cabin and lived there for another 11 years until his death in 1897 from pneumonia. His obituary in the local paper made no mention of his crime. It described him as a lifelong resident and member of one of the county's founding families. Cora's fate, in contrast, was marked by a struggle that never truly ended. Dr. Latimer's medical records, preserved in the county archives, document her condition in the months following her rescue. She remained largely nonverbal, capable of single words and short phrases, but unable or unwilling to construct complex sentences. She could not tolerate enclosed spaces, experiencing what we would now recognize as severe panic attacks when brought indoors. She was terrified of men, including her father and brothers, and would only allow her mother and female neighbors to care for her. The family tried to reintegrate her into normal life, but normal was an impossibility. Cora could not attend school. She could not participate in the social activities that girls her age enjoyed. She aged physically, but remained in many ways frozen at 7, the age she had been when her childhood ended. The Dunsworth family eventually left North Carolina, moving to eastern Tennessee in 1885, seeking distance from the memories and the community that had failed them. Ada Dunsworth died in 1889 at the age of 43. The death certificate listed exhaustion as the cause, but those who knew the family understood it was grief that killed her. Emmett followed 6 years later. Cora lived with her older brothers, moving between their households as they married and started families of their own. She was cared for but never independent. She died in 1926 at the age of 48, never having spoken more than simple sentences, never having recovered the self she might have been. The historical record is remarkably silent on what happened to the Vizzy family. Edmund continued to prosper, his timber operations expanding as railroads finally reached Watauga County in the 1890s. The family name remained prominent in local affairs through the early 20th century. By the time the Great Depression devastated the mountain economy, the Vizzys had diversified their holdings and weathered the crisis better than most. The last direct descendant sold the family's remaining land in the 1960s. The hollow where Cora was kept has long since been reclaimed by the forest. There are no markers, no plaques, nothing to indicate what happened there. But the case left traces in other ways. It was cited in early 20th century discussions of child welfare laws in North Carolina. It appeared in legal journals debating the boundaries of criminal responsibility and mental competency. It became, for a time, a cautionary tale about the dangers of isolation and the vulnerability of the poor to those with power. And then, gradually, it faded. New tragedies displaced old ones. The people who remembered firsthand died. The story became legend, then rumor, then was forgotten entirely by all but a handful of local historians. What can we learn from the story of Cora Dunsworth? On one level, it is simply a horror story, a reminder of human capacity for cruelty. But on another level, it reveals the structural failures that allowed such a crime to occur and then be inadequately punished. The social dynamics of Appalachia in the 1870s created a perfect environment for predation. Poor families were dependent on wealthy landowners. Authority was concentrated in the hands of a few. Women and children had virtually no legal standing. When Luther Vizzi took Cora, he was not just exploiting her vulnerability. He was exploiting a system that valued him more than her, that protected his family's reputation more than her safety, that allowed him to serve 3 years for destroying a child's life. The inadequacy of the sentence reflects the values of the era. Class mattered more than justice. Family connections mattered more than evidence, and the testimony of the powerless, even when they could speak, mattered hardly at all. Cora could not testify, but even if she could have, would it have changed the outcome? History suggests not. The scales were weighted long before the trial began. There is also the question of what Luther Vizzi truly wanted. His journal suggests he saw himself not as a criminal but as a savior of sorts, rescuing Cora from what he perceived as ignorance and hardship. This delusion is not unique to him. Throughout history, those who commit the most heinous acts often construct elaborate justifications. They are not doing harm, they are doing good. They are not destroying a life, they are creating a better one. This capacity for self-deception, for reframing cruelty as care, is perhaps more disturbing than simple malevolence. At least with pure evil, we can understand the motivation. With twisted benevolence, we confront something more incomprehensible. The physical isolation of the mountains made Luther's crime possible, but it was the social isolation of the Dunsworth family that made it sustainable. They had no power, no voice, no ability to demand a thorough investigation when their daughter vanished. They were tenant farmers on Vizzi land, dependent on Vizzi goodwill for their survival. This dynamic ensured silence even after Cora was found. The family left North Carolina because they wanted to, but because staying was untenable. They had been victimized twice, first by Luther, then by a legal system that valued his family's status over their daughter's suffering. In the end, Cora Dunsworth's story is not really about one man's crime. It is about a society that enabled that crime through its inequalities and then compounded the harm through its failures of justice. It is about how power protects itself, how the vulnerable are sacrificed, and how history often forgets those sacrifices unless someone takes the time to remember. The story of Cora Dunsworth reminds us that history's darkest chapters often hide in plain sight. Buried in county archives, forgotten in old newspapers, erased from family histories that prefer to remember accomplishments rather than atrocities. If you found this story compelling, you might be interested in exploring other cases of Appalachian injustice from this era, or the broader history of child welfare laws in the American South. Subscribe for more forgotten dark history and consider supporting this channel. Until next time, remember, the past is never quite what it seems.